Big Brother is watching you. It's one of those lines that never really leaves your mind once you've heard it. It came from George Orwell's 1984, a book about a world where privacy didn't just die, it was murdered in plain sight. But here's the thing. That world, it isn't fiction anymore. Look around you. Every swipe you make, every tap, every time you drive, call, or even breathe near a smart device. Someone, somewhere, knows. Maybe it's your employer, maybe it's a corporation, or maybe it's the government itself. And it's all logged, tracked, analyzed, and stored for safety. At least that's what they tell you. But what happens when someone says, enough? What happens when one man decides he's done being watched and tries to fight back? This is the story of a man who tried to take his privacy into his own hands, and in doing so, accidentally brought one of America's busiest airports to its knees. Our story starts in August of 2012 in Newark, New Jersey, a place where the noise never stops. Planes taking off, trucks rumbling, radios crackling, the heartbeat of industrial America. In the middle of it all was a man named Gary Bojczak. He wasn't a hacker, he wasn't a spy, he wasn't even an activist, he was an engineer. A regular guy working for a construction firm called Tilcon, the same company that helped pave the George Washington Bridge. Gary's job was straightforward: drive around job sites, inspect materials, oversee progress. His company truck, a bright red Ford F-150, was his office on wheels. But that truck came with something Gary never asked for: a GPS tracker. Tilcon owned hundreds of vehicles. To manage them, the company had installed GPS tracking on every single one, so dispatchers could know exactly where each truck was at all times. To most people, that might sound like harmless logistics. To Gary, it felt like a collar around his neck. Every stop, every route, every break, logged. He knew that somewhere, a manager could look at a screen and see exactly where he was sitting, and something about that made him burn inside. Maybe it was the idea that he couldn't even take a coffee break without being tracked. Maybe he just hated the feeling of being watched, like his autonomy didn't belong to him anymore. Whatever it was, it ate at him. Gary wasn't the kind of man who made noise. He wasn't a protester or a whistleblower. But sometimes, rebellion doesn't start with a march, it starts with a whisper. So he began to think, what if the system stopped seeing me? At first, it was just a fantasy. Maybe there was a truck without GPS. Maybe he could find a way to disable the tracker without anyone noticing. But every route ended in the same conclusion: it wasn't possible. Unless he stopped the signal itself. That's when Gary discovered something small, cheap, and illegal. A device that could make him invisible. You can buy it online for under $100. It fits in the palm of your hand. Plug it into your car's lighter port, and suddenly, your vehicle disappears from every GPS screen in the world. A signal jammer. It's marketed as a privacy tool, a way to stop being tracked. But the truth? It's a weapon, one that doesn't destroy things physically, it destroys information. And in a world built on constant tracking, that's enough to cause chaos. Gary ordered one. The package came discreetly, no label, no warning, just a tiny piece of metal and circuitry that promised freedom. He plugged it in, a small light flickered, and just like that, his truck vanished from Tilcon's GPS system. No signal, no trace, no questions. It was perfect. For the first time in years, Gary felt invisible. He drove around Newark like a ghost, free from oversight, free from eyes in the sky. And somewhere deep down, he smiled. He didn't realize that this tiny act of rebellion, this little victory, had just switched off something far more important than his GPS tracker. Because a few miles away, Newark Liberty International Airport was about to lose sight of its planes. At that exact same moment, the FAA began receiving frantic reports. Planes coming in for landing were losing navigation precision. A new GPS-based landing system called SmartPath, a multi-million-dollar safety upgrade developed by Honeywell, was suddenly glitching out. No one knew why. Signals were scrambled, pilots were confused, and somewhere on the ground, a red Ford pickup kept driving through the interference zone. What Gary thought was protecting his privacy was actually jamming the same radio frequencies that guided planes safely to the ground. One man, one truck, one jammer, and one of the busiest airports in America, blinded. As the interference spread, emergency alerts went out. The FAA scrambled teams, and within hours, the case reached the desks of the Federal Communications Commission, the only agency capable of tracking rogue radio signals across the country. They didn't know it yet, but they weren't chasing a terrorist. They weren't chasing a hacker. They were chasing a construction worker who just didn't want to be watched anymore. And what they were about to uncover would shake the government's faith in its own infrastructure. But before the FCC could find Gary, they had to find the ghost. And that hunt would take them deep into a side of America most people never see, where freedom, privacy, and law collide in the shadows. The next morning, Newark looked like it always did. Gray skyline, trucks idling at stoplights, the smell of diesel and rain. And somewhere in that mix was Gary Bojczak, rolling out of his driveway in the same red Ford F-150 that had just brought an international airport to its knees. He didn't know it yet. He thought the day was ordinary. To him, the little silver jammer plugged into his lighter socket was nothing more than an insurance policy, a small rebellion in a world that wanted every detail of his schedule. Gary was 40-something, stocky, with a habit of squinting when he talked. People who worked with him said he was reliable, never missed a shift, never caused trouble. But under that quiet reliability was a deep resentment that had been simmering for years. Every job site he visited required check-ins, digital logs, progress photos. His phone tracked his movements, the truck tracked his route. Even the badge that opened the Tilcon gate kept a timestamp. He used to joke that one day they'd put trackers on the coffee cups just to know how fast employees drank. Nobody laughed. Surveillance doesn't always arrive with flashing lights or hidden cameras. Sometimes it creeps in wearing a corporate smile. It starts as efficiency, then it becomes safety. Then one morning you wake up and realize there's nothing left that's truly yours. Gary had grown up in a time when privacy meant shutting your front door. Now, it meant nothing. Everywhere he looked, someone had given up a piece of themselves for convenience. GPS in cars, Wi-Fi in fridges, smart thermostats that learn your schedule. He saw it as a trade we never consented to, a silent deal made above our heads. So when his company installed GPS trackers in their vehicles, Gary didn't just see technology, he saw betrayal. At first, he tried to play along. He told himself it wasn't personal, that Tilcon only wanted to save on fuel or verify deliveries. But the feeling never left. Every time he took a detour for lunch, every moment he idled too long at a red light, he imagined a manager watching the little blinking dot labeled Gary, Truck 47, creeping across a map. One afternoon, he parked near the docks for 10 minutes to watch ships roll in, a small break before heading to another site. Later that evening, his supervisor mentioned, casually, "Saw you took the scenic route today." Gary laughed it off, but inside something snapped. That single comment, those 8 harmless words, proved what he'd feared all along. He was never alone. He started researching. Not how to quit his job, not how to complain, but how to disappear. Forums, blogs, little corners of the internet where truckers complained about spy boxes and fleet eyes. Some bragged about unplugging trackers. Others posted pictures of mysterious black devices that could make signals vanish. They called them jammers. The descriptions sounded like magic. Blocks GPS, hides your location, total privacy at the push of a button. It was illegal, sure, but compared to being watched every second, it felt almost moral. Gary bookmarked a few pages, hesitated for a week, then ordered one anyway. It arrived in a padded envelope, the kind you'd expect a flash drive to come in. No logo, no manual, just a stubby metal cylinder with a tiny antenna. That was it. Freedom for $99. The first time he plugged it in, he didn't expect much. A faint click, a red LED glow. He checked his phone. Google Maps stopped updating. He looked at the company tracker app. No signal. It worked. That feeling, that sudden absence of visibility, was intoxicating. For the first time in months, he could drive wherever he wanted without a digital leash. He didn't realize that invisibility can be addictive. And like any addiction, it comes with a cost you don't see until it's too late. Gary thought he'd outsmarted the system. But in truth, he just found a blind spot, one that stretched all the way into the sky. And that blind spot was about to pull the federal government straight to his doorstep. The day after his first test, Gary felt lighter. No one called asking where he'd been, no questions about the long route, no reminders to log his mileage. To him, silence meant success. He didn't know that silence also meant something else: interference. At Newark Liberty International, technicians were still combing through readouts from the previous afternoon. The data looked wrong: distorted waveforms, GPS signals flickering like candlelight. The SmartPath guidance system, which was supposed to make landings smoother, had gone haywire for nearly 40 minutes. They assumed it was equipment failure, maybe a glitch, maybe solar activity. No one suspected that the culprit was a trucker with a cheap gadget idling a few hundred yards from the runway perimeter fence. Gary parked near one of Tilcon's asphalt sites that morning, less than a mile from the airport. To him, it was just another job: clipboard, notes, radio check. But each time he started the truck, the jammer hummed, sending out invisible ripples that collided with the frequencies guiding passenger jets overhead. Those ripples didn't just confuse GPS trackers, they blinded antennas, scrambled navigation channels, and flooded the airwaves with electronic noise. Up in the control tower, the radar looked fine, but the GPS-aided readings, the ones that kept planes perfectly aligned, blinked out one by one. Controllers called it ghosting, aircraft suddenly appearing to drift off their paths, only to snap back seconds later. Pilots didn't notice at first, then warnings started flashing across cockpits. Something, somewhere, was jamming the sky. By mid-morning, the FAA had logged multiple incidents. They couldn't pinpoint the source. The interference came and went, but every pattern traced back to the same patch of ground, the industrial district just outside the airport. That's where Gary spent most of his shift. The engineers at Honeywell were called in. They confirmed it wasn't a software bug. The SmartPath receivers were being hit by an unauthorized signal. Strong, localized, and mobile. That one word, mobile, changed everything. The FAA passed the case to the Federal Communications Commission. The FCC's Enforcement Bureau specialized in tracking rogue transmitters, pirate radio stations, illegal boosters, and yes, GPS jammers. In a quiet Manhattan office, a senior FCC field agent named John Matusak got the alert. Possible interference with navigational frequencies near Newark. Pattern consistent with jamming. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his direction-finding gear, tossed it into a government-issued sedan, and hit the Lincoln Tunnel. As he drove, a handheld spectrum analyzer on the passenger seat pulsed with faint static. Each pulse meant signal, each dip meant distance. He followed the trail like a hound following scent. 40 minutes later, he reached the airport perimeter, and the analyzer screamed to life. Somewhere nearby, the interference was peaking. What Matusak didn't know was that the source wasn't some elaborate transmitter or terrorist device. It was sitting inside a mud-splattered Ford pickup with a Tilcon Engineering decal on the door. He sat in the cab, unwrapping a sandwich, engine running, jammer humming softly beneath the radio dial. He stared out toward the runway where jets lifted off in perfect intervals, unaware that his $99 privacy tool had turned into a weapon of disruption. To Gary, it was peaceful, a rare moment without pings, messages, or bosses checking his coordinates. For the first time, he felt in control. But control is an illusion when the entire sky is listening. The FCC agent parked near the fence line, stepped out, and raised his handheld antenna. The meter jumped. He turned left, signal dropped. Turned right, signal spiked. He followed it down the service road until it pointed straight at a red truck idling near a pile of crushed stone. He could see the Tilcon logo through the dust. He radioed dispatch, found the source. Gary noticed him approaching, a man in a reflective vest holding strange equipment. "Morning," the agent said. "Mind if I ask what you're doing here?" Gary blinked. "Working." "Why?" The agent nodded at the truck. "Mind turning off the engine for a second?" Gary reached forward, twisted the key. Instantly, the analyzer in the agent's hand went silent. That was all the proof he needed. In that moment, the entire mystery of Newark's disappearing GPS signals unraveled. But for Gary, the real turbulence was only beginning. Because what he saw as a $99 act of freedom, the federal government saw as a federal crime. Long before the FCC ever showed up, Gary's rebellion began with something small, a thought that refused to go away. He would be driving alone at night, highway lights sliding across the windshield, and that voice in his head would whisper, "They know where you are right now." He'd glance at the GPS tracker bolted under the dash. It looked harmless, but to Gary it might as well have been a camera pointed at his soul. That paranoia slowly hardened into conviction. If the system could watch him without asking, then he had every right to disappear. When the FCC agent tapped on the truck window, Gary flinched. The man wore an orange vest, a badge clipped to his belt, and carried something that looked like a TV antenna from another planet. "Sir, can you turn off your engine?" Gary hesitated, twisted the key, and the agent's handheld meter went silent. The static that had blanketed the sky vanished in an instant. "Thank you," the agent said softly. "You've just cleared Newark Airport." Those words hit like ice water. Gary stepped out of the cab, blinking against the sun, still not understanding what he'd done. He thought maybe his truck's radio had malfunctioned. Maybe it was some freak interference. But the agent's tone wasn't casual. Within minutes, 2 more government vehicles pulled up. One of them bore the unmistakable blue and white FCC seal. An official with a clipboard approached. "Sir, are you in possession of a device that transmits radio frequencies?" Gary blinked. "A what?" The agent nodded toward the dashboard. "That thing plugged into your lighter socket." Gary reached in, pulled out the jammer. "You mean this? It just stops tracking." The agent sighed. "Yes, that's exactly the problem. What Gary didn't realize is that GPS jamming doesn't just hide your truck. It doesn't care what it blocks. The global positioning system runs on a paper-thin radio whisper, broadcast from satellites 12,000 miles above the Earth. Those signals arrive weaker than the background noise of the universe itself. That's why even a tiny consumer jammer can smother them for miles. So when Gary's truck parked near the airport fence, his privacy bubble became a blackout zone for an entire air traffic navigation system. The SmartPath network, built to guide planes precisely onto the runway, suddenly couldn't see. For 40 minutes, every aircraft on final approach had to switch to manual radio guidance. Controllers scrambled, pilots sweated, and one man's quest for privacy became a nationwide headline, though Gary didn't know that part yet. At headquarters, technicians reviewed the agent's logs. They confirmed the source, one red Ford F-150. Under federal law, intentionally transmitting on restricted frequencies is a crime punishable by fines up to $100,000 and imprisonment. The FCC didn't usually go nuclear on first-time offenders, but shutting down an airport? That was different. They impounded the jammer, photographed the truck, and took Gary's statement. He cooperated fully, even handed over the online store receipt. He wasn't a hacker. He was a man with a $99 toy and a catastrophic misunderstanding of physics. Still, intent didn't matter. Interference of that scale was treated like sabotage. By the time Gary's manager heard what happened, news of the outage had reached corporate HQ. An airport shutdown linked to a company vehicle. It didn't matter how innocent the cause was. Gary was fired that same day. Security escorted him off the property while coworkers watched in silence. For them, it was a strange headline come to life. "Engineer accidentally jams airport." For Gary, it was the end of everything he'd built. Weeks later, a certified letter arrived. The FCC cited him for willful and malicious interference. The proposed fine, $42,500. He wrote back, explaining that he never meant to harm anyone. He was just tired of being tracked. After a review, the agency reduced it to $32,000 for cooperation. Still, 32 grand might as well have been $1 million. When he looked at the paperwork, the irony almost made him laugh. The government that could triangulate his signal from space couldn't tell the difference between malice and exhaustion. Inside the FCC, the case sparked quiet panic. If one untrained engineer with an off-the-shelf jammer could cripple a major airport system, what could a coordinated attack do? Analysts ran simulations. They discovered that just 20 high-power jammers placed around key airports could disable GPS-based landings nationwide. Worse, detection was difficult. The signals blended with background noise until they were already causing havoc. Suddenly, the story wasn't about Gary anymore. It was about vulnerability. When journalists caught wind of the report, headlines exploded. Tiny device shuts down Newark Airport. One man's privacy crusade exposes national weakness. Talk shows debated whether privacy gadgets should even exist. Lawmakers demanded tighter import controls. Customs agents started seizing jammers at the border. For Gary, every article was another reminder that his name had become a cautionary tale. He wasn't just unemployed, he was infamous. The case forced regulators to admit something they'd avoided for years. Critical infrastructure, airports, shipping, finance, emergency services, all depended on the same fragile thread of GPS. And that thread could be snapped by a toy bought online. It exposed a truth that made everyone uneasy. In the digital age, control and chaos are separated by inches of plastic and a USB plug. Gary never stood in front of a crowd shouting about freedom. He never wrote manifestos or joined movements. All he wanted was privacy from a boss who tracked his lunch breaks. But that small act of rebellion revealed the thin line between personal liberty and public safety. He proved that one person's attempt to disappear can make an entire system go blind. The government thought closing Gary's case would end the problem, but it didn't. Because soon, investigators realized this wasn't an isolated incident at all. It was just the first crack in a national pattern. And what they uncovered next turned Gary's story from a local mishap into a federal threat model. When the FCC logged the final report on Gary Bojczak, they expected routine paperwork. Offender identified, fine issued, case closed. But inside the Enforcement Bureau, one analyst stared at the signal tracking data and frowned. The interference footprint around Newark wasn't a single blip. It was dozens. Weeks before Gary's arrest, smaller bursts of static had already been recorded along I-95, near ports and outside other airports. Different times, different vehicles. One pattern kept repeating: moving sources, short duration, same frequency band. Gary wasn't unique. He was just the first one they caught. The analysts mapped every GPS disruption reported in the past year. When the dots appeared on the screen, they formed a constellation that stretched across the entire eastern seaboard. Truck stops, industrial zones, highways used by logistics companies. It wasn't sabotage, it was convenience. Drivers who wanted to hide from dispatchers, companies cutting corners, individuals selling privacy boosters out of glove compartments. The FCC realized they were facing something new: civilian interference at national scale. And worse, nobody even knew it was happening. They began sending undercover agents to truck shows and online forums. Everywhere they looked, GPS jammers were being marketed with different names: personal privacy device, signal shield, tracker blocker. Dozens of sellers operated out of warehouses in China, routing shipments through Canada or the Caribbean to slip past import restrictions. Each unit cost less than a tank of gas. Each one could cripple million-dollar systems. Inside the FCC's cyber analysis wing, an internal memo circulated: if these devices proliferate unchecked, transportation, emergency response, and even national defense operations will be vulnerable to localized GPS denial. It sounded dramatic, until the Department of Homeland Security confirmed that several federal convoys had already reported unexplained GPS loss during highway transport. By late 2013, DHS had taken notice. They launched Project Silent Sky, a joint task force between the FCC, FAA, and Department of Transportation. Their mission? Locate and map every GPS-denied zone in the continental US. They deployed detection vans, disguised as delivery trucks, antennas hidden under fiberglass shells, laptops humming in the back. Every time the signal meter spiked, coordinates went into a national database. Within months, thousands of micro blackouts were documented, enough to prove the US GPS infrastructure was riddled with holes. Gary's $99 jammer had exposed a vulnerability big enough to scare Washington. Meanwhile, private companies started noticing strange anomalies in their own systems. Shipping fleets lost tracking for minutes at a time. Construction equipment rental firms found hours missing from GPS logs. Even rideshare platforms saw cars drifting off maps. At first, they blamed software updates. Then regulators quietly told them the truth. Jammers, corporate legal teams scrambled to update employee policies. Importers started screening containers for hidden transmitters. Insurance companies quietly added GPS interference clauses to contracts. The economy ran on data. Now everyone realized how easy it was to jam. A report reached the Pentagon. During a training flight in Maryland, a C-130 navigation system had briefly failed near a highway overpass. Investigators traced it to a civilian pickup truck below, another illegal jammer. That's when the word threat model officially entered the conversation. Cyber warfare wasn't always digital. Sometimes it came from a $99 gadget and a bad decision. Defense analysts modeled worst-case scenarios. Coordinated jammer networks near airports, ports, or communication hubs. In simulations, even partial interference caused cascading failures. Delayed landings, lost shipments, compromised timing signals in stock exchanges, all from devices you could hide in a cup holder. Other nations took note. Britain reported dozens of similar incidents around Heathrow and Gatwick. South Korea found fishing fleets using jammers to hide from maritime patrols. In China, local black markets openly sold navigation silencers. Suddenly, Gary's story wasn't an American curiosity. It was global proof of concept. An underground arms race in radio silence had begun. Behind closed doors, policymakers faced an uncomfortable truth. For decades, they had told citizens, if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. Now millions of ordinary people were fighting back with the simplest weapon imaginable, a device that said, then you can't find me at all. Gary's act of rebellion had forced governments to admit the obvious. Trust had eroded so deeply that citizens would rather break the law than be watched obeying it. Meanwhile, Gary was at home, unemployed, reading articles about the Newark incident. His name had become shorthand for a problem no one wanted to acknowledge. Reporters called. He stopped answering. In one rare interview years later, he said, I wasn't trying to make a point. I just wanted to drive without being followed. But whether he meant to or not, he had made a point, one powerful enough to alter federal policy. Gary's case became a required lesson inside the FCC's enforcement training. Slides showed the red truck, the jammer, the Newark blackout. Underneath, one sentence. Every system fails where people stop trusting it. The government began treating human frustration as a data point, a new variable in national security models. They called it privacy-driven noncompliance, a polite way of saying, people are starting to fight back. Gary's rebellion had revealed how fragile the grid was, but what came next would reveal something even darker, how far governments were willing to go to keep control of that grid, and how the rest of the world would soon pick a side. When the FCC vans left and the headlines faded, Gary Bojczak was left with something heavier than a fine. Silence, the kind that hums in your ears when your world stops making sense. He'd spent years trying to escape surveillance, and now the very thing he was hiding from, the system, was the only thing watching him. Letters from lawyers, notices from the Department of Transportation, calls he didn't answer. Every piece of mail felt like another eye staring back. $32,000. For Gary, that wasn't just money. It was years of savings, gone before he could blink. He sold his motorcycle, cashed out a small retirement fund, and still couldn't cover the full penalty. Tilcon's HR department sent him a final settlement envelope, termination confirmation, benefits canceled, badge access revoked. Friends tried to reach out, but how do you comfort someone who's been branded a federal cautionary tale? Within months, Gary's house grew quiet. He stopped answering the door, stopped mowing the lawn. The neighbors whispered, he's the guy who jammed the airport. He'd drive occasionally, this time without the jammer. But the paranoia never left. Every police cruiser in the rearview mirror looked like the FCC coming back for round 2. He'd wanted privacy. Now he had it. Absolute isolation. Meanwhile, Gary's story became a morality tale in boardrooms and break rooms alike. Companies reminded employees that tampering with tracking systems was a federal offense. Tech vendors used his case as a sales pitch. Upgrade to our new anti-jam GPS suite. Gary's failure had become profitable. Privacy had become a commodity again, one sold to those who could afford it. A year after Gary's fine, the same government agencies that punished him quietly partnered with corporations to make surveillance stronger. Airports rolled out redundant GPS systems. Trucking companies upgraded to tamper-proof trackers. New sensors were built to detect even low-power jammers like Gary's. The irony? All that new equipment collected more data than before. The lesson they took from Gary's story wasn't, maybe we're watching too much. It was, we need to watch harder. After Newark, the anti-interference industry exploded. Startups promised foolproof tracking, resilient navigation, encrypted telemetry. Governments poured billions into backup satellite constellations. But in every meeting, someone always asked the same question. What happens when people just don't want to be tracked? There was never a good answer, because you can build stronger networks, but you can't engineer trust. Gary learned that lesson the hard way. Privacy, he realized, wasn't free. It was expensive, both in money and in loneliness. He'd read articles that painted him as careless, even dangerous. He wanted to correct them, to say, I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. But anything he said would live online forever. Another digital footprint he couldn't erase. So he stayed quiet. His rebellion had been loud enough already. The real tragedy of Gary's story wasn't the airport outage. It was what it revealed about all of us. We want safety and freedom, control and invisibility. We want to be seen when it benefits us and disappear when it doesn't. Gary's $99 jammer was the physical embodiment of that contradiction. A cheap, desperate way to reclaim something priceless. And for one brief moment, it worked. Inside Washington, Gary's name became shorthand for a new kind of threat. One that didn't come from hackers or terrorists, but from regular citizens tired of being monitored. They called it micro-insurgency. Tiny acts of technological defiance that, when multiplied by thousands, could destabilize systems designed for order. So the FCC and DHS built new detection grids, expanded monitoring powers, and quietly pushed laws that allowed faster searches of suspected signal violators. Every fix created another surveillance layer. Every safeguard made Gary's original point louder. The system could only protect itself by watching everyone even closer. Gary paid his fine, lost his job, and vanished from headlines. But the consequences of his rebellion kept growing, shaping policy, industry, and public consciousness. He had set out to escape the eye of Big Brother, and in doing so, proved that Big Brother was real and more fragile than anyone thought. The price of privacy wasn't $99. It was everything that came after. Gary's story might have ended there, a man crushed by his own rebellion. But the shockwave of what he exposed didn't stop in Newark. Because once the world saw how easy it was to jam the system, countries everywhere began rewriting the rules of privacy and control. What started as one man's quiet act of defiance was about to become a global argument, one that would decide who owns the air itself. When the Newark case hit international press, most people shrugged it off as a weird American story. One guy, one gadget, one airport. But inside governments around the world, Gary Bojczak's name appeared in classified briefings, circled in red. He had done something unthinkable, proven that the digital nervous system of modern civilization could be disrupted by an individual. Not a terrorist, not a rogue state, just a man in a pickup truck. And that terrified everyone. Within a year, countries began racing to outlaw signal interference devices. Britain pushed through emergency legislation, making possession punishable by prison time. Canada created a new category called intentional radio obstruction. China, ironically one of the biggest manufacturers of jammers, quietly cracked down on domestic sales, while continuing to export them overseas. Governments claimed these laws were about safety, but beneath the surface, they were about control. Because once citizens learned they could vanish from the grid, every government's surveillance stream started to fracture. As the ban spread, tech corporations saw opportunity. Telecom giants teamed up with defense contractors to market anti-jam ecosystems. They built sensors that could triangulate rogue frequencies within seconds, sell them to airports, ports, even shopping malls. The irony was suffocating. The same corporations that had monetized our every movement were now selling protection from the people who dared to hide from them. And because fear sells, governments bought everything. By 2015, simply owning a device capable of blocking signals, any signal, was enough to land someone on a watch list in many countries. People were arrested for carrying Wi-Fi blockers or even modified routers. In one notorious case in London, a delivery driver who'd used a jammer to avoid fleet tracking was sentenced to 8 months in prison. The judge told him, "You thought you were protecting your privacy. In fact, you endangered the public." That line spread through tabloids and talk shows, weaponized into a slogan: privacy equals danger. Civil rights groups pushed back. In Europe, digital rights activists argued that banning jammers was treating symptoms, not causes. If people were desperate enough to break the law for privacy, maybe the real crime was how little privacy they had left. The EU held hearings on data collection and corporate tracking. Out of that came the GDPR, the world's strongest privacy regulation at the time. But even that law had limits. It couldn't stop governments from watching, only companies from selling. The debate kept circling the same paradox. We wanted privacy, but we also wanted safety, convenience, navigation, connection. You can't jam one without damaging the other. While civilians argued, militaries took notes. Russia and China began experimenting with high-power GPS spoofers, devices that didn't block signals but faked them, tricking enemy navigation systems into seeing false coordinates. The US responded with classified counter-jam technologies. Gary's $99 device had accidentally kicked off a global arms race in radio warfare. What started as a privacy story turned into a geopolitical chess match. Satellites were retuned, new encryption standards rolled out, entire branches of defense budgets were redirected to what they now called PNT security, positioning, navigation, and timing, all because one man proved the system could blink. Back home, the cultural landscape changed too. People started joking that privacy was the new contraband. Phones recorded 24/7, cars reported their own mileage, smart speakers listened for keywords, and when someone tried to opt out, to ditch social media, cover their webcam, or leave their phone at home, they weren't praised. They were questioned. What are you hiding? Being untraceable had become suspicious. Governments used that fear to tighten surveillance infrastructure. More cameras in public spaces. Facial recognition systems sold as anti-terror tools. Even smart cities built around total connectivity. Every layer was justified as protection against the next Gary Bojczak. The message was clear: disappear and you're the problem. Of course, resistance didn't die, it evolved. Hacktivists began designing encrypted phones, decentralized networks, offline messaging tools. A movement calling itself the Quiet Web spread through forums and encrypted chat rooms. Its motto: if they can't find us, they can't own us. They weren't trying to take down systems, they were trying to live outside them. Digital minimalists, privacy maximalists. People who saw invisibility not as defiance, but as self-defense. As the world outlawed the tools of privacy, technology marched forward into an era where tracking was built in by design. New cars came with always-on telematics. Smartphones broadcasted emergency IDs even when turned off. Digital assistants responded to voices they weren't supposed to hear. And when people complained, companies said the same thing Gary's boss once said: it's for efficiency, for safety. Don't worry about it. But history had already proven what happens when people start worrying. Gary Bojczak's story had circled the globe and come back twisted. He'd fought surveillance and lost. The world watched him fall and used his failure as a blueprint to justify watching everyone else. Privacy hadn't just become rare, it had become suspicious, even dangerous. To want it was to be guilty of something. That was the final irony of the modern age. The harder we fought to be seen as safe, the less safe it became to be unseen. The world had cracked down on privacy in the name of safety, but it didn't solve the problem. It only buried it deeper. Because in the next chapter of this story, the eye in the sky would stop belonging to governments altogether. It would belong to us. And what happened next would change the meaning of surveillance forever. The story of Gary Bojczak was supposed to end with governments tightening control, with new fences built around the digital sky. But that's not where it ended, because the moment governments stopped trusting citizens, citizens stopped trusting them. And in that vacuum, something stranger happened. We started watching ourselves. At first, it didn't feel like surveillance. It felt like convenience. We carried devices that counted our steps, tracked our sleep, measured our heartbeats. We posted our meals, our moods, our locations, not because we were forced to, but because we wanted to share. It was validation disguised as visibility. The world told us, if you want to be loved, you have to be seen. So we turned our lives into open windows. And slowly, surveillance stopped needing an outside eye. It was built right into who we were. Governments didn't need to install cameras anymore. We bought them ourselves. Doorbells with cloud storage. Cars that recorded the road and the driver. Smart TVs that listened to improved voice recognition. Even the phone sitting in your pocket right now, always on, always connected, became both the watcher and the watched. And the question changed. It was no longer who's spying on us. It was why do we keep giving them permission? When Gary jammed his GPS, he disrupted a signal. When we open social apps, we feed them. Every swipe, every search, every face on every screen is logged, cross-referenced, monetized. We've built jammers for our attention, but instead of blocking, they capture us. The machines learn to listen, not just for noise, but for patterns. They can predict when you're tired, when you're lonely, when you're about to buy something or break down. It's a quieter kind of control, one we consent to with a tap on accept all cookies. Remember when privacy meant anonymity? Now anonymity itself looks suspicious. Anonymous accounts are flagged. Encrypted messages trigger security alerts. Cash payments raise eyebrows. The system no longer fears invisibility, it hunts it. And yet, millions still chase it. VPNs, encrypted phones, privacy browsers. They're the new underground. But even those tools come with a price. They mark you as someone with something to hide. Trust used to be the invisible currency of modern life. You trusted that your employer wouldn't misuse your data. You trusted that your government wouldn't spy without reason. You trusted that the apps on your phone existed to serve you, not study you. That trust is gone. Every scandal, every leak, every breach, every hidden microphone eroded the foundation a little more. Until one day, people realized they didn't believe in systems anymore. They believed in themselves. So instead of fighting surveillance, they internalized it. We became our own monitors, curating our behavior for algorithms, censoring ourselves before anyone else could. That was the quietest collapse of all. When Orwell wrote 1984, Big Brother was an authoritarian figure. Today, Big Brother has no face. He's a network. Every friend who tags you, every follower who screenshots you, every stranger who scrolls past your profile. Surveillance isn't imposed, it's reciprocal. We spy on each other. We measure, compare, comment, and archive. The system doesn't need to control us anymore. We do it ourselves. Gary's little red truck became a relic of a simpler rebellion. He fought physical surveillance with physical resistance. A jammer that screamed, "Leave me alone." If he tried that today, the system wouldn't even need radio frequencies to find him. His phone would give him away. His truck's onboard computer would upload his location. His smartwatch would betray his pulse. He'd never need to plug in a jammer because the modern world doesn't track with signals. It tracks with consent. We traded privacy for comfort, willingly. And like all trades, it came with small print we didn't read. The more data we gave, the more personalized everything became. Ads, news, even friendships. But personalization isn't kindness, it's containment. It builds a cage so comfortable you forget the bars exist. That's the genius of modern surveillance. You don't need to fear it because it makes you feel special. In the end, Gary's story leaves us with the same question that haunted him. How much are we willing to give up to feel safe? And what happens when safety becomes indistinguishable from control? Because if one man's $99 jammer could blind an airport, imagine what billions of self-surveilling citizens can do. Not by breaking the system, but by feeding it until it becomes too powerful to question. The rebellion that started with Gary's need for invisibility ended with a society obsessed with visibility. The jammer silenced signals. We amplified them. In the age of cameras and algorithms, we no longer fear being watched. We fear being forgotten. That's the true collapse of trust, when we stop asking for privacy because we no longer believe it exists. But history doesn't stop at collapse. Every system that breaks is also an invitation to rebuild. And out of the ruins of trust and the ashes of privacy, a new generation is beginning to draw a different blueprint, one that could redefine what freedom means in a connected world. After Gary Bojczak's 2012 case, regulators around the world began re-evaluating how dependent society had become on GPS. In 2014, the U.S. Department of Transportation and the Department of Homeland Security created a joint program called Resilient PNT, Positioning, Navigation, and Timing, to protect navigation signals from interference. The FAA strengthened airport monitoring and required redundant landing guidance systems that don't rely solely on GPS. By 2018, Congress had ordered a national backup network to ensure critical timing data could survive a GPS outage. The lesson was clear. If a $100 device could blind an airport, the nation needed resilience, not just reaction. While engineers worked to shield radio frequencies, lawmakers confronted a different kind of exposure: the constant collection of personal data online. In 2018, the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, took effect, setting the world's strictest rules on how companies could store and process user information. California soon followed with the CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act, 2020, giving residents the right to see and delete data held by businesses. Over the next few years, dozens of US states drafted similar laws. These weren't about GPS signals, but they came from the same fear Gary had felt: the loss of control over one's own information. The private sector began to adjust under pressure from consumers and regulators. Apple introduced app tracking transparency in 2021. forcing apps to request permission before following users across services. Google announced plans to phase out third-party cookies in Chrome and limit background tracking on Android. Encrypted messaging apps like Signal, WhatsApp, and Telegram grew rapidly as people sought communication free from data harvesting. For the first time since the early 2000s, tech companies competed on privacy features instead of just speed and design. In parallel, the US and its allies invested in backup navigation systems. The UK and South Korea expanded LRAN, a low-frequency ground-based network immune to satellite jamming. The US Coast Guard revived tests of similar technology, and the DHS promoted GPS alternative PNT standards for critical infrastructure. Airports added GBAS and ILS redundancy. Cell towers received timing diversity modules, and the FAA developed real-time interference maps to spot rogue signals within seconds. The system that Gary had unintentionally blinded was now surrounded by layers of fail-safes. Out of the constant tug-of-war between control and freedom, emerged a younger generation of technologists focused on privacy by design. Projects like ProtonMail, DuckDuckGo, and Brave Browser grew into global brands. Nonprofits such as the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the Tor Project received record donations and mainstream attention. Even hardware manufacturers joined in. Companies like Purism and Framework built laptops with physical camera kill switches. Privacy was no longer the language of rebels. It was a selling point. Major scandals kept fueling change. In 2013, Edward Snowden's NSA disclosures exposed global surveillance programs spanning telecom companies and foreign governments. In 2018, the Cambridge Analytica investigation revealed how social media data had been used to influence elections. Each event pushed public opinion further toward transparency and accountability. By the early 2020s, public polls showed privacy ranking alongside healthcare and inflation as a top political concern in the US and Europe. Gary Bojczak never became a public figure again. His case remains on the FCC website as a reference example of GPS interference enforcement, but his mistake became a teaching tool for engineers and policymakers. Proof that small acts of defiance can reveal massive flaws in critical systems. Every time a new rule, standard, or backup network was drafted, the ghost of that red Ford F-150 hovered in the background as a warning of what fragility looks like. Today, the fight over privacy and security continues, but the conversation has matured. Governments acknowledge the need for redundant infrastructure and clearer limits on surveillance. Citizens expect transparency and consent in every digital transaction. And technologists are designing systems that can withstand both malice and mistake. The world didn't erase surveillance, but it learned to question it. That question alone is progress. Gary Bojczak's jammer never should have worked, but because it did, the modern navigation and privacy landscape was rebuilt with resilience and awareness in mind. From the FCC's crackdowns to the GDPR's data rights revolution, his accident forced the world to rethink how much trust we place in invisible systems. The legacy is technical and human at once, redundant frequencies in the air, and a renewed belief on the ground that privacy is not a crime, it's a responsibility. A $99 mistake triggered a decade of reform. And in that unexpected chain reaction, the world didn't just rebuild its networks, it rebuilt its values. Hey, if you made it all the way to the end, thank you. Seriously, I'm just one guy researching, writing, editing, and voicing these stories, so every like, share, or comment helps more than you think. If I missed a detail, got something wrong, or there's a story you think deserves a deep dive, drop it in the comments. I read every one. This is my first video, and your feedback is what keeps this channel growing and getting better. So hit that like button if you enjoyed this one, share it with someone who'd find it interesting, and subscribe if you want to see more stories about lost hacker history. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and maybe don't plug any mysterious devices into your car.